Hi, my name is Rob Heinman, and in this video I'll be demonstrating Cluster OS Rolling Upgrade, which is a new feature in Windows Server 2016. We designed Cluster OS Rolling Upgrade to reduce the friction of upgrading your failover clusters from Windows Server 2012 R2 to Windows Server 2016. Using this feature, you can upgrade a physical cluster or a virtual guest cluster. There is no downtime for a Hyper-V cluster or for a scale-out file server cluster. Other workloads will have downtime equivalent to failover time. It's a very flexible feature, and you can add new hardware if needed, or you can use existing cluster nodes. Using existing cluster nodes, you can use a clean OS install, which we recommend, or you can use an in-place OS upgrade if you're using inbox drivers. In today's demonstration, I'll be upgrading two nodes. I'll be upgrading a Hyper-V compute cluster, and I'll be upgrading a scale-out file server cluster. We'll start with the compute cluster. What we'll do is we'll take one node at a time in this cluster, we'll drain it, evict it, upgrade the operating system to Windows Server 2016, and then we'll add it back into the cluster. We'll rebalance workload as necessary. Then we'll repeat the process again for the next node. We'll pause it, drain it, evict it, upgrade the operating system to Windows Server 2016, and then add it back into the cluster. After the final node in the cluster has been upgraded, we'll use the update cluster functional level to complete the upgrade and to enable the Windows Server 2016 failover cluster features. We'll repeat the process again for the scale-out file server cluster, the storage cluster. We'll take each node in this cluster, we will drain it, evict it, upgrade the operating system to Windows Server 2016, we'll add it back into the cluster, we will rebalance workload if necessary, and then we'll do the same thing for the next node in the cluster. We drain it, evict it, upgrade the operating system, add it back into the cluster. Finally, we'll use the update cluster functional level commandlet to complete the upgrade process. This process means that only Windows Server 2016 nodes can join the cluster, and it also activates all of the new Windows Server 2016 failover cluster features. Let's see how this works. We'll start on Windows Server 2012 R2. Let's run the Failover Cluster Manager UI. Here you can see I'm already connected to R2 clusters. In the Scale-Out File Server cluster, I have one role, that's the Scale-Out File Server, and it has two shares. Continuously available File Share 1 and continuously available File Share 2. On the Hyper-V compute cluster, I have two VMs that are using that storage. SQL 2016 VM1, and as you can see here, when I connect to this VM, I have a simple T-SQL script that I'll run to show you that the workload will keep running as I move this VM around and as I upgrade the cluster underneath it. Okay, let's close this VM. Okay, first we're going to take compute node 3, pause it, then we're going to evict it. Once it's out of the cluster, we'll upgrade the operating system to Windows Server 2016. Through the miracle of video editing, this will look very quick. Also, we'll manage the upgrade process from a Windows Server 2016 node. So here's the node that we just upgraded. Let's use the Failover Cluster Manager and connect to our cluster. We'll connect to the Scale-Out File Server cluster, and we'll connect to the Hyper-V Compute cluster. At this point, we can add the node that we've just upgraded, which is compute node 3, into this cluster. Now at this point, let's move VM2 to compute node 2, or to compute node 3, sorry. This will free up compute node 2 so that we can upgrade it. It's still running. Now, we're ready to pause Compute Node 2. We'll pause it, let's evict it, and now, after it's been upgraded, we're ready to add it back into the cluster. And there we go. Now, let's balance our VMs. We're going to move VM2 now to Compute Node 2. Since I need capacity for VM1, I'm going to move it to Compute Node 3. Now, just to show you that that live migration works successfully, let's open the VM and have a look at it. Our query is still running, so now we can pause and drain Compute Node 1. Let's evict it from the cluster. We'll upgrade it to Windows Server 2016, and then we'll add it back into the cluster. At any point when we're adding a node into the cluster, we can run cluster validation. Okay, in this case, we have a few warnings, but it's safe to ignore them. Let's complete adding the node. Okay, success. Now let's quickly check that our query is still running. And it is, there we go. Since we've upgraded each node in this cluster, we're ready to use the commandlet to complete the upgrade. First, let's query the functional level of the cluster. A Windows Server 2012 R2 cluster has a functional level of 8. Now let's run the update cluster functional level commandlet. Let's query the functional level at this point, and we'll see it's a 9, which means that the cluster has been fully upgraded to Windows Server 2016. Okay, looking at our scale-out file server role, we see that it's on node 1. Let's drain node 3, and then we'll evict it from the cluster. We'll upgrade it to Windows Server 2016, and then we'll add it back into the cluster. We'll do the same process with scale-out file server node 2. We'll pause it, then we'll evict it, we'll upgrade it to Windows Server 2016, and then we'll add it back. Now finally, we'll move the scale-out file server role to node 2. This happens very fast. And as you can see, our VMs are still running, even though the file shares have just been moved to a different owner node. Okay, great. Now we're ready to drain scale-out file server node 1, and then we'll evict it from the cluster. After we upgrade it to Windows Server 2016, we can add it back in. In this case, we'll skip validation for the sake of expediency. Again, going into PowerShell, we'll first query the cluster functional level of the scale-out file server. We see that it's 8, which is Windows Server 2012 R2 level. Now we'll run the update cluster functional level commandlet, which will increment the cluster functional level to 9. So we query again, and we see that the cluster functional level is 9. Okay, great. We've got 2 clusters that have been upgraded now. So everything's up and running, everything's at 2016. Let's have a quick look at our SQL query, and we'll check to see if it's still running. And yes, indeed, it is still running. In summary, I've demonstrated how we can upgrade a Hyper-V compute cluster and a scale-out file server cluster from Windows Server 2012 R2 to Windows Server 2016 with zero downtime to the VMs. Cluster OS Rolling Upgrade can upgrade a physical or a guest cluster. You can use either the UI or you can use PowerShell to achieve this. For further information on Windows Server 2016 and also Cluster OS Rolling Upgrade, please visit TechNet. Thank you.